It's obvious that elves hate dwarves. It's not like elves are even trying to hide it a little bit. Whenever the two races encounter each other, elves look down from behind their noses and stare down at the shorter, stouter, and arguably uglier people of Durin. But why do the elves have such disdain for the dwarves? When we open the history books of Middle-earth, we can find plenty of reasons, but there's only one real answer. Now, before we get to it, I want to clear something up right off the bat. Most folks would point to the time the dwarves were contracted to place a cimmeral into a necklace, which they later tried to steal, as the origin of the dwarf-elf hate. But it's not. It's just an example of it. Now, if you're not familiar with that tale, I'll give you a quick rundown. Now, the most precious gems in all of Arda were known as the cimmerals. They were made in the years of the trees, before the sun and the moon were even born, and the gems were filled with the light of the trees of Valinor. The stones were so beautiful that one would later be placed in the sky and transformed into an actual star. Well, a few centuries after they were created, King Thingol managed to get his hands on one, and in his possession he also had one of the greatest treasures that the dwarves of Middle-earth had ever built, known as Noglamir. This was a beautiful necklace that they had constructed in years prior. Now, Thingol contracted the dwarves to place the cimmeral into the necklace and combined make one of the most beautiful pieces of jewelry in the world. But after completing it, the dwarves wanted it for themselves. Thingol refused, and so the dwarves killed off the Elf King and tried to run off with the necklace. Only 2 of those dwarves survived, and by the time they got back to their kingdom, they concocted a story about how the elves killed them for no reason at all, and that was enough to launch the dwarves of Novigrad into an all-out war. This event, combined with a later conflict a few years later, resulted in the destruction of one of the greatest elf kingdoms in Middle-earth. Now, what does this have to do with the origin of the elf-dwarf feud? Well, it'd be really easy to see why the elves and dwarves would hate each other based on this story. Obviously there was miscommunication on both sides, and the small company of dwarves initially committed the first act of violence, and then later they continued their lie and prompted an entire host of dwarves to sack Doriath, the elven kingdom. But all of this could have been avoided if King Thingol had realized the dwarves had some claim to Noglamir, because they actually created it in the first place. But again, I just want to emphasize that this was not the actual origin of their feud. It goes back much farther, eons as a matter of fact. The hatred the elves feel for the dwarves was actually there because of the gods. Before the birth of elves, men, or even ents, an earthly Valar, one of these gods in Tolkien's universe, known as Aule, decided that he wanted to make children. And, his desire wasn't that unique, as the other gods like Manwë and Yavanna also desired to have sentient creatures around them, not just simply birds and animals. But Aule took it a step further. Instead of just hoping that he could have children, he decided to create them. As a god of metal, stone, and crafts, he gathered clumps of the earth and fashioned them into the bodies of the first 7 dwarves. But this was a big no-no. You see, there was a single god who was above all the earthly gods. This was Eru Ilúvatar. He was the creator of the universe, and the lesser gods, the Valar and Maiar, who toiled on the earth like Aule, were basically like his angels. Now, Eru had a specific plan for the universe, and on Arda, the name for Earth, the plan was for the elves to come into existence first, and then men. Dwarves weren't even on the list at all, but Aule broke that plan when he decided to not only make dwarves, but to bring them into existence before Eru's elves. This is important, because this is actually the source of the elf-dwarf hatred. When Eru Ilúvatar found out about the dwarves, he reached out from his realm beyond the physical universe and spoke to Aule. He scolded his son a bit, but then he also offered him a compromise. He promised that he would allow the dwarves to live, but they would have to sleep until the elves arrived. Eru was sympathetic to Aule's desires, but he wanted the elves to experience the world first. And it was right then that Eru Ilúvatar, the creator of the universe, announced the feud between the elves and dwarves. He said, quote, "Often strife shall arise between thine and mine, the children of my adoption and the children of my choice." He could have been making a simple observation, based on how differently he knew the dwarves and elves would behave. Or he could have had an active role in creating the feud. Whatever the case may be, we can see how Eru speaks that the feud between the two might simply be because, siblings fighting over a toy, both of them are now forced to share Arda at similar times when originally it was only meant to be for the elves. Whatever the case may be, the origin of the elves' hatred for the dwarves is much older than the cimmerals, and it actually starts right here at the very birth of the dwarves in Aule's caves.